In 1985, the small town of Riverdale, Ohio, with a population of about 12,000 people, lived a measured life. It was a time when America was experiencing an economic boom, and in small towns, people knew each other by name. Riverdale was a typical American suburb. Neat houses with lawns, a local school, a church where almost everyone went on Sundays, and several cafes where the news was discussed. In this quiet place, no one expected that a family drama would turn the life of one of the local families upside down and shock the entire community. The story that will be discussed began unnoticed but led to tragic consequences, leaving a mark on the memory of the residents. We are talking about the Wilson family, whose life seemed ordinary until circumstances were revealed that no one could have predicted. This story is based on real events, taking into account the social and cultural characteristics of that time. The Wilson family lived on the outskirts of Riverdale in a two-story house with a white picket fence. The father, Thomas Wilson, 45, worked as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. His wife, Catherine, 42, was an accountant at a small firm. They had two children, Emma, 22, and James, 20. Emma, a tall girl with long brown hair, had recently graduated from college and had returned home while she looked for work. James, a dark-haired, athletic guy, was studying at a local technical college and worked part-time at the same shop as his father. Neighbors described the Wilsons as a close-knit family. They regularly held barbecues in the backyard, attended church, and participated in community events. Emma and James had been close since childhood. They spent a lot of time together playing basketball in the backyard, riding bikes around the neighborhood, and watching movies at the local theater. Their parents encouraged this friendship, believing it strengthened the family. In 1985, when Emma returned home from college, their bond became even closer. They would often sneak away to talk, spending hours discussing their lives, dreams, and plans. James would share his worries about the future with his sister, and Emma would talk about the difficulties of finding a job. Their interactions seemed natural, but over time, they began to go beyond the usual sibling relationship. Riverdale was a conservative town at the time. Family values and moral standards were strictly observed, and any deviation from the accepted rules was frowned upon. The Wilsons, like many others, tried to live up to these expectations. However, changes began to occur in their home that none of the neighbors noticed. Emma and James began to stay home alone more often, avoiding their friends. They appeared less often at town events, and their evening walks became more secretive. Their parents, busy with work, did not pay attention to this, believing that the children were simply enjoying each other's company after a long separation. In the spring of 1985, Emma began keeping a diary where she wrote down her thoughts. She mentioned feeling lonely despite her closeness to her brother. James, in turn, became more withdrawn, avoiding conversations with his father about his studies. Their behavior did not arouse serious suspicion, but some acquaintances noticed that Emma and James held hands longer than was customary or exchanged glances that seemed unusual. No one, however, dared to ask questions. The social context of the 1980s in America played a major role. Television and radio actively discussed family values, and religious communities such as the Riverdale Baptist Church emphasized the importance of moral principles. At the same time, young people began to experiment with new ideas, which sometimes led to conflicts with older generations. For Emma and James, who grew up in such an environment, any deviation from the norm could cause internal conflict. Their closeness, which began as an innocent friendship, gradually developed into something more, which they themselves did not fully realize. By the summer of 1985, Emma and James began spending even more time together, even avoiding family dinners. Catherine once noticed them locked in Emma's room for an entire evening, but she didn't pay any attention to it, thinking they were watching a movie. Thomas, tired from work, rarely interfered with the children's affairs. The Wilson family continued to live their lives, unaware that their familiar world was about to begin to crumble. By the summer of 1985, At the Wilson home in Riverdale, Ohio, Emma and James had become even more secretive. Their closeness, which had once seemed like a warm family relationship, had developed into something they both carefully hid. Emma, a 22-year-old fresh out of college, and James, a 20-year-old engineering student, spent much of their time together. They often retreated to Emma's room or the backyard, out of their parents' sight. Their conversations became quieter, their glances more guarded, especially when Thomas or Catherine were around. In June 1985, Emma and James began taking steps to keep their meetings discreet. They agreed to use certain phrases to communicate their plans. For example, if Emma said, "I'm going for a walk," it meant she was waiting for James by the old oak tree at the end of the street. These meetings took place late at night after their parents were asleep. They would walk along quiet Riverdale streets, avoiding lighted areas, or sit in James's car parked in a vacant lot outside of town. These moments allowed them to feel more at ease, but they always returned home separately to avoid arousing suspicion. The social environment in Riverdale in the 1980s was strict. The local Baptist church that the Wilson family attended regularly held sermons on family values and moral standards. Any relationship outside the traditional was frowned upon. Emma and James, who had grown up in this environment, understood that their feelings were unacceptable. Emma's journal, which she kept at the time, contains entries about feelings of guilt. She wrote that she could not explain why she was so attached to James but did not want to lose that connection. James, in turn, began to socialize less with his friends, citing his busy schedule at college and work. Their behavior began to attract attention. One day, a neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, noticed Emma and James coming home late at night holding hands. She mentioned it to Catherine, who brushed it off, saying that the children were simply close. However, Catherine began to notice little things. Emma stopped discussing her plans with her, and James avoided questions about girls. The parents, however, were too busy with their own affairs. Thomas often stayed late at the workshop, and Catherine prepared reports for the firm. In July 1985, Emma and James became even more careful. They stopped leaving traces of their meetings. Emma put her diary in a hiding place under the floorboards of her room, and James began erasing the notes in his notebook where he had noted their meeting places. They also agreed not to write each other notes or call each other on the home phone. Instead, they used code words that only they understood.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
For example, the phrase "I forgot my book" meant to meet at an agreed-upon place. Despite all the precautions, their relationship began to affect their behavior. Emma became irritable, especially when her friends asked why she didn't go on dates. James, usually outgoing, turned down invitations to parties, preferring to spend time at home. Their friends began to notice the changes. One of James's friends, Mark, once asked why he spent so much time with his sister, but James abruptly ended the conversation. The 1980s context heightened their internal conflict. The pop culture of the time, from MTV to Hollywood movies, romanticized love. But in conservative towns like Riverdale, any deviation from the norm was perceived as a threat to society. Emma and James may have felt trapped between their desires and the strict expectations of those around them. Their secret was becoming heavier, but they continued to find ways to be together. By August 1985, tensions were mounting in the Wilson household. Catherine found Emma and James whispering in the garage one day and asked what they were talking about. Emma said she was talking to her brother about fixing the car, but Catherine thought she was nervous. Thomas, who usually kept his hands off his children, noticed that James had become quieter. However, the parents did not yet connect these changes with anything serious, believing that the children were going through adolescence. Emma and James, despite the risks, continued to meet. They found new places to hide: an abandoned barn on the edge of town, a deserted lot by the river, the backseat of a car. These meetings became a way for them to cope with their feelings of isolation. But each time they returned home with the knowledge that their secret might be exposed. By the fall of 1985, the atmosphere in the Wilson home in Riverdale, Ohio, was growing increasingly tense. Emma and James continued to hide their close relationship, but their behavior was beginning to raise more and more questions from those around them. Parents, neighbors, and friends were noticing oddities that could no longer be ignored. The family, once a model of comfort and stability, was now under scrutiny for small details that were gradually shaping up to be disturbing. Catherine, Emma, and James's mother, was the first to notice the changes. In September 1985, she noticed that Emma and James were spending an inordinate amount of time together, often locking themselves in Emma's room or leaving the house without explanation. One day, when Catherine returned from work earlier than usual, she found them in the living room, sitting closer than usual. When she entered, they suddenly fell silent and moved away from each other. Catherine asked what was going on, but Emma quickly replied that they were discussing plans for the weekend. Catherine didn't press the issue, but the incident got her thinking. Thomas, the father of the family, also began to notice changes. James, usually open and talkative, began to avoid communicating with him. When Thomas asked about college or work, James answered briefly and evasively. One day, Thomas noticed that James came home late at night, although he said he had been to see a friend. Thomas assumed that his son was simply growing up and wanted more freedom, but he still mentioned it to Catherine. They agreed to keep an eye on the children but did not consider the situation serious for now. Neighbors began to notice things, too. Mrs. Thompson, who lived across the street, saw Emma and James leaving the house late at night, holding hands several times. She told a friend who worked at a local church. Rumors began to spread. Although no one dared to directly accuse the Wilsons of anything inappropriate in Riverdale, where a family's reputation was of great importance, such talk could cause serious damage. Emma and James's friends also noticed the changes. Emma's friend Rachel would invite her to parties, but Emma would always decline, citing tiredness or business. Rachel once asked why Emma spent so much time with her brother, but Emma abruptly changed the subject. James's friends, in turn, noticed that he stopped going to the bar or football games with them. Mark, his best friend, once tried to talk to James alone, but he brushed him off, saying he had a lot to do. The social context of Riverdale in 1985 added to the pressure. The local Baptist church the Wilsons attended preached vigorously about morality and family values. The pastor often spoke about the importance of maintaining boundaries in relationships, especially within the family. These sermons likely increased Emma and James's feelings of guilt, but they continued to hide their affair. Emma's diary began to record the difficulty of pretending to her parents and friends. She wrote that she was afraid their secret would be revealed, but she could not stop. In October 1985, the situation escalated. Catherine found a note in Emma's room that said, "Meet me by the river. 10 o'clock. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting resembled James's. Catherine decided to talk to Emma, but she said the note was from a friend. Catherine didn't believe her, but she didn't make a scene. Instead, she began to keep a closer eye on the children, checking where they went and what time they returned. Thomas, for his part, noticed that James was becoming nervous. One day, while they were working together in the workshop, James dropped a tool and reacted harshly when his father asked if everything was okay. Thomas assumed his son was worried about his studies, but he told Catherine anyway. The parents began to discuss whether to confront their children directly, but they feared that this would only alienate them. At the same time, rumors in town were growing louder. At one of the church meetings, someone mentioned seeing Emma and James in a car in a vacant lot. This information reached Catherine through a friend who advised her to be more careful. Catherine decided to check Emma's room while she was at work. She found a hiding place under the floorboards where Emma's diary was lying. Catherine did not read it, but the fact that her daughter was hiding something increased her anxiety. Emma and James, feeling the pressure mounting, became even more cautious. They stopped meeting by the river and began using an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. They also agreed to see each other at home less often so as not to attract attention. However, Their attempts to hide their relationship only made matters worse as they became increasingly withdrawn and distant. By November 1985, tensions were running high in the Wilson home in Riverdale, Ohio. Emma and James's carefully guarded secret was beginning to crumble under the weight of their parents' suspicions and the gossip of the town. Their close relationship, which began as a secret between two young people, had set in motion a chain of events that would change their lives and the lives of their family forever. In early November, Catherine, unable to bear the uncertainty, decided to read Emma's diary, which she found in a hiding place under the floorboards. She waited until Emma and James left the house and opened the entries. The diary contained detailed descriptions of Emma's meetings with James, their conversations, and the feelings they experienced. Catherine was shocked. She could not believe that her children, brought up in strict moral traditions, could cross such boundaries. Catherine decided to tell Thomas everything, but first, she wanted to talk to Emma alone.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
That evening, Catherine called Emma into the living room while James was at work and asked her point blank about her relationship with her brother. Emma initially denied everything, but under the pressure of her mother's questions, she broke down and admitted that their relationship had gone beyond the ordinary. She begged Catherine not to tell Thomas, claiming that she and James had tried to stop but had failed. Catherine, shocked and confused, did not know how to react. She told Emma not to see James in secret anymore and promised to think about what to do next. When Thomas returned home, Catherine told him about her conversation with Emma, omitting the details from the diary. Thomas was furious. He believed that their family had always followed the right principles, and he could not accept that his children had found themselves in such a situation. He immediately called James into the garage for a talk. James, feeling that the secret was out, tried to justify himself, but Thomas would not listen. The conversation escalated into shouting, and Thomas forbade James to go near Emma, threatening to throw him out of the house if it happened again. Emma and James, under pressure from their parents, began to avoid each other at home. Catherine watched their every move, and Thomas became stricter with James, forcing him to spend more time in the workshop. However, the ban only increased their desire to be together. They began to find new ways to meet, using an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. These meetings became less and less frequent, but only more intense. The social context of Riverdale in 1985 made matters worse. Word of Emma and James's erratic behavior reached the local church, and the pastor mentioned in one sermon that families needed to be vigilant to protect their moral fiber. This added to the pressure on the Wilsons, who felt judged by their neighbors. Catherine, who had previously been an active member of the church community, began to attend meetings less frequently to avoid the looks. In mid-November, the situation got out of hand. Emma, unable to withstand the pressure, wrote James a note, offering to leave Riverdale together. She hid the note in his car, but Thomas accidentally found it when he checked the car. He made a scandal, accusing Emma and James of destroying the family. That same evening, a major quarrel occurred at the Wilson house. Thomas shouted at James, demanding that he leave the house immediately. Emma tried to defend her brother, but Catherine told her to shut up. In the midst of the quarrel, James, unable to bear it, ran out of the house, slamming the door. Emma, left alone, felt trapped. She was afraid she would lose James forever and blamed her parents for their reaction. That night, she left the house and headed to the warehouse where she and James sometimes met. James, who had also come there to calm down, was depressed. Their conversation quickly turned into an argument. Emma insisted on running away, and James believed that this would only make the situation worse. At some point, their emotions reached a peak, and events took an irreversible turn. By the next morning, the Wilson home was quiet. Catherine and Thomas, not knowing where their children were, began to worry. They called friends and acquaintances, but no one had seen Emma and James. Soon, the police received a report of an incident at an abandoned warehouse that shook all of Riverdale. On the morning of November 15, 1985, police in Riverdale, Ohio, were called to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. A local farmer passing by noticed signs of a struggle and alerted authorities. When officers arrived, they found a tragic scene that shocked the small town. Emma Wilson was found lifeless, and her brother James was in shock nearby. The incident was the culmination of a chain of events that began with their secret affair and led to irreversible consequences. This chapter describes how the Wilson family story was resolved and the marks it left on their lives and community. Police immediately cordoned off the warehouse and began an investigation. James was taken to the station for questioning. He was depressed, barely able to speak, and unable to explain what had happened. Investigators determined that Emma had died from injuries sustained in a physical altercation, but details remained unclear. The case soon attracted local media attention, and Riverdale newspapers began to fill headlines with stories of the Wilson family tragedy. Residents of a town accustomed to a quiet life were stunned. Catherine and Thomas arrived at the police station after learning what had happened. Catherine was inconsolable, and Thomas, usually reserved, looked broken. They could not believe that their family, which had seemed ordinary until recently, was at the center of such drama. The police informed the parents that James was in custody, and the case was classified as a criminal one. Catherine and Thomas refused to comment to the press, but rumors of Emma and James's affair quickly spread throughout the city. The investigation lasted several weeks. Investigators studied Emma's diary, which Catherine gave to the authorities, and also questioned friends and neighbors. It turned out that on the night of the tragedy, Emma and James met in a warehouse after an argument with their parents. Their conversation escalated into an argument during which the situation got out of hand. James admitted that they had quarreled over her suggestion to leave town, but claimed that he did not mean to hurt her. The investigation determined that Emma's death was the result of an accident during their conflict, but James still faced charges. In January 1986, James was charged with manslaughter resulting in death. The trial was a major event in Riverdale. Local residents attended the hearing, and reporters from neighboring cities covered the case. James's attorney insisted that the incident was a tragic accident caused by emotional stress. The prosecutor, however, emphasized that James understood the consequences of his actions. In March 1986, the jury found James guilty and sentenced him to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole. For the Wilson family, the verdict was another blow. Catherine and Thomas stopped appearing in public, avoiding neighbors. They quit their jobs and moved to another city to start anew. The church community they had once been active in was divided. Some sympathized with their grief. Others condemned them for failing to prevent the tragedy. The Wilson home was sold, and in Riverdale, their name soon became associated with a sad story. The social context of 1980s America played a role in how the case was perceived. The conservative values espoused in towns like Riverdale made Emma and James's story the subject of heated debate. Some residents blamed their parents for not supervising enough, while others pointed to societal pressures that left young people with little space to openly discuss their feelings. A local newspaper published an article highlighting how strict moral standards could lead to isolation and internal conflict. James served 3 years of his sentence and was paroled in 1989. He never returned to Riverdale after his release and is rumored to have settled in another state under a new name. Catherine and Thomas never communicated with him again, and their fate remained unknown to the townspeople. Riverdale gradually returned to its normal life. But the Wilson story was long discussed at church gatherings and in local coffee shops. The tragedy left its mark on Riverdale history, reminding us how personal decisions can have irreversible consequences. It also highlighted the complexity of human relationships amid the strict social expectations that characterized small-town America in the 1980s.